This video covers the blood glucose and obesity part of the cardiovascular disease section of Unit 2, which is the last section of this. A lot of this will relate to your knowledge of National 5 and also the previous stuff about cardiovascular disease. So you really will need to go back and make sure that you're okay with the National 5 knowledge. From this, you'll need to know the relation between blood glucose and then cardiovascular disease as well, and know some examples of this. So for blood glucose, we're just going to talk about the regulation of that just now, and then we'll do the diabetes ones in the next video. So this is mainly going to cover the National 5 points and then cover the higher bits that will then add on to that. So when blood glucose is high, right, so elevated at a really, really high level over a long period of time, right, so chronic elevation, that's typically due to untreated diabetes or untreated regulation or poor regulation of the blood glucose. The problem with this is then that it damages the endothelium cells because they take in too much glucose because there's too much glucose in the blood. Now that then leads to atherosclerosis, right? And those examples are things like cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, etc., which is why I'll put an example of stroke here. And then your PVD, which is your peripheral vascular disease as well. Now that being larger blood vessels. Now in small blood vessels, like the ones that supply the retina, for example, because those get damaged, it can lead to hemorrhage. And hemorrhage just means bleeding. So hemorrhage of the blood vessels that supply the retina and the eye. And this is why people with diabetes that's untreated and not taken care of very well can have issues which lead to blindness. Another issue would then be kidney failure, which is sometimes called renal failure. Renal is the biological term for kidneys, because those blood vessels in the kidney are constantly then having to lose glucose to the urine. And the last one is what's called peripheral nerve dysfunction. Now we referred to peripheral when it came to the last part of the cardiovascular disease stuff. So peripheral nerve dysfunction basically means dysfunction means that the nerves don't work or they don't work correctly. And peripheral means the ones that supply typically the limb nerves. Okay, so if blood vessels that supply those nerves in the limbs are damaged, that then leads to issues with those nerves. So then that leads to numbness and it leads to pain and other things like that. And this is why sometimes people with diabetes, if it's untreated and not taken care of correctly, because of the damage to the nerves, it can then lead to damage to the skin, which can lead to infection because people with diabetes tend not to be able to heal very well. So you have hemorrhage in the retinas, you have renal or kidney failure, you have peripheral nerve dysfunction as issues that would be related to the small blood vessels being damaged by high blood glucose levels. So to try and avoid all these things, what we need to do is make sure that blood glucose is regulated, and it's regulated by the process of negative feedback. So just like the reproductive hormones or the last bit about cholesterol, negative feedback basically brings things back down to normal or brings things back up to normal if there's a change. So from National 5, you need to know that the changes in blood glucose are detected by the pancreas. And within the pancreas, there are proteins, receptor proteins, that would then detect that. So those receptors will detect whether blood glucose is going up or down, and then will instruct the pancreas as to what to do about that. So blood glucose is controlled or regulated by 3 hormones. Now from National 5 we knew 2, but you now need to know 3. Now the 2 you need to know from National 5 are insulin and glucagon. Now these 2 are produced by the pancreas and then they will act on their target tissue, which is target proteins on it, receptor proteins, which will then allow the hormone to bind to it. And these receptor proteins in that are found in the liver. So their target tissue is the liver. Now, these three hormones all travel in the blood. Okay, and are produced by endocrine glands. So the endocrine gland that produces insulin and glucagon is the pancreas. And there's then another endocrine gland that you'll now need to know, which is called the adrenal gland. And that's because the adrenal gland produces adrenaline. So that's your third hormone that will actually help to control blood glucose. So negative feedback's involved. Pancreas has receptors that detect blood glucose, and three hormones are involved: insulin, glucagon, and adrenaline. Now I'll come back to adrenaline at the end, but for now I'm going to talk about the regulation of blood glucose, the one that you knew from National 5 really. Okay, so initially what we're going to do is we're going to start with a normal blood glucose, and then think about what happens when blood glucose changes. Okay, so when blood glucose changes then, we're going to typically talk about, or first of all, talk about an increase in blood glucose. So if blood glucose increases, usually that's due to the person having a meal. Okay, because they've taken in glucose from their diet. So again, like we said before, detected by the pancreas, and specifically receptors in the pancreas. So the pancreas then, once it's detected change in blood glucose and detected the increase in blood glucose, what it'll do is it'll produce more of a particular hormone. Now in this instance, it's insulin that would be produced in a greater quantity. Okay, but the other hormone that it produces, glucagon, it produces less of it. So it never stops producing the hormones, it just produces less. So in this example, it's less glucagon and more insulin. Now insulin then travels to the liver and it promotes the conversion or activates the conversion of that glucose into its storage form. And that storage form is glycogen. Okay, and this occurs in the liver. Now because glucose has then been taken out of the blood and stored in the form of glycogen in the liver, that then causes blood glucose to decrease. So that would then return to normal blood glucose because it is dropped down due to the action of that insulin. Okay, so when blood glucose increases, receptors in the pancreas detect it and more insulin is produced. Now in the liver then, that promotes the conversion of glucose into glycogen, which is a storage carbohydrate. And then because that glucose is stored as glycogen, then it removes it from the blood and that brings blood glucose back to normal. Now for the opposite direction, if blood glucose decreases, right, for decrease, that may be because a person has either been sleeping or they've been exercising. Blood glucose is dropped. So again, like before, it's detected by receptors in the pancreas. And that pancreas then will then produce or more or less of particular hormones. So in the example above, when we talked about an increase, it was more insulin that's produced. If you have low blood glucose in your body, you do not want to produce more insulin because that would store more of that glucose away. You want to release more glucose into your blood. So you would now produce less insulin and more of the other hormones. You produce more glucagon and therefore less insulin. Okay, so just like the previous example as well, the hormones then would go to the liver, traveling in the blood, and that specific hormone of glucagon then promotes the conversion of that glycogen that was stored in the liver into glucose. Okay, and then because of that, that glucose then is released from the liver into the blood. Okay, so it is released into the blood, and therefore, because glucose is released into the blood, there causes an increase in that blood glucose, and it returns it back to normal. Okay, so that decrease then is again detected by the pancreas and the receptors in there. More glucagon is produced instead of insulin, and then glycogen is converted into glucose, and it then causes the increase in that blood glucose. Now, just as a wee summary to show you this, glucose is a carbohydrate which gets converted into the storage form of glycogen in the liver. Now, the hormone that does that then would be insulin. So insulin promotes the conversion of glucose into glycogen. Now, when blood glucose is low, you need glycogen to be released and broken down back into glucose, and then that glucose released into the blood. And it is glucagon that does this. So basically all this stuff that we talked about so far is all National 5 revision. So the next bit will actually cover the higher part, which is to do with adrenaline. So adrenaline is another hormone produced by another endocrine gland. So it's produced by the adrenal glands. So this is a kidney here. And this here on the top of the kidney is an adrenal gland. So adrenaline will raise blood glucose, and it raises it during fight or flight responses. Right, so stressful examples, people being chased or given a fright, or anything to do with high stress. So even just before exams and things are fight or flight responses. And it's mainly because your heart rate will go up, your breathing rate go up, and your muscles need more blood and oxygen and glucose within the blood. So adrenaline is then used to raise blood glucose to prepare yourself for that fight or flight. So it does that by then affecting those two hormones we talked about before. So to cause more glucose to be released into the blood, adrenaline will stimulate glucagon production. And when it does that, it allows more glucose to be released from the liver. Right, just the same as we referred to before. Now, because this adrenaline is basically involved in this fight or flight response, you don't want to be storing the glucose. So therefore, you want to inhibit the production of insulin. Right, and because of that, you then prevent that glucose being stored, and therefore keep it in the blood. Okay, and you prevent it from being stored specifically as glycogen in the liver. Okay, so an essay question could refer to all the previous stuff I've talked about, and then the last part would be really referring to your adrenaline. So it raises blood glucose produced by the adrenal glands, and it stimulates glucagon production and inhibits insulin production. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to then do the next video on the two types of diabetes and how blood glucose then is failed to be regulated by those two.